Pick up your kitchen knife right now and look at the board underneath it, not the food, the board itself. If it is plastic, here is what is happening every single time you use it. Whether you have ever thought about it or not, the blade is not just cutting your food, it is cutting the board. And every cut leaves a wound in that surface too small to see but large enough to matter. Researchers at North Dakota State University ran the numbers on exactly what comes off that surface. Their estimate, published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology, a single plastic cutting board can shed somewhere between 14 and 80 million microplastic particles into your food every year. Not into your sink, into your food. Directly. Every chop, every slice, every dice. This is not a story about contamination from somewhere else. This is not packaging or tap water or something that happened at a factory 3 states away. This is the tool in your hand doing exactly what it was designed to do and producing a byproduct nobody put on the label. I want to walk you through how researchers actually measured this, what happens to the roughly half of those particles that do not go down the drain, what a newer study published this year found when they fed these exact particles to laboratory mice over 12 weeks, and what that tells us about a process happening in your own gut that nobody can directly observe yet. Then I will tell you exactly what to do about it, and it is simpler than you think. Here is the shape of this video. First, the original measurement that started this entire line of research and why the method matters as much as the result. Second, the detail, almost no coverage of this topic mentions where the other half of those particles actually go. Third, a study published this year that took the next logical step, feeding these particles to mice for 12 weeks and measuring what happened to their gut. Fourth, why polypropylene and polyethylene, the 2 most common cutting board plastics, do not behave the same way under a blade. And fifth, the specific material swap that eliminates this exposure route entirely, along with what to do if you are not ready to replace the board you already own. I look at the science behind ordinary household materials and what they do once they meet the human body. I am not a physician. Nothing here is medical advice. My job is to read the primary research, separate what has been measured from what is still being investigated, and explain the difference clearly. With cutting boards, that difference matters more than usual because the exposure mechanism is unusually well documented, even while the long-term health consequence is still an open question. The North Dakota State University team did not start by asking whether cutting boards were dangerous. They started by asking a narrower, more answerable question. Under realistic kitchen conditions, how many particles does a plastic cutting board actually release, and does the type of plastic make a difference? They tested the 2 materials found in nearly every kitchen supply aisle, polyethylene, which is typically softer and more flexible, and polypropylene, which is harder and more rigid. Their hypothesis going in was reasonable. A softer plastic might dent more easily under a blade and release more material. What they found was closer to the opposite for some measures and confirmed for others, which is exactly the kind of result that makes researchers trust their own data. Polypropylene boards released more particles by mass and by particle count than polyethylene, by a significant margin, somewhere in the range of 15 to 70% more, depending on which measurement you look at. The harder plastic, intuitively the one you might assume would resist a blade better, actually shed more material under the same chopping conditions. There was a second variable that mattered just as much as material type: what you are cutting. The team tested chopping with and without a vegetable on the board, using carrots as their test case. Cutting with the vegetable present increased particle release compared to chopping on the bare board. The presence of food being prepared on the surface, the exact condition every cutting board exists for, increases the amount of material that comes off. When the researchers extrapolated their per-cut measurements to a year of normal home cooking, they landed on the range I mentioned earlier, 14.5 million to just under 80 million particles annually, depending on board material. That is not a typo, and it is not a worst-case scenario. That is the calculated range across the materials tested under standard conditions. Most articles about this study stop at the headline number and move straight to suggesting wooden alternatives. There is a detail in the underlying research that deserves more attention than it gets because it changes how you should think about the number itself. Roughly half of the microplastic particles generated during a cutting action do not end up on your food at all. They remain on the board surface and wash down the drain when you clean it. This sounds on first read like good news. It means the actual ingestion number is lower than the total generation number. But sit with that fact for a second longer. It means a cutting board is simultaneously contaminating your food and contaminating the water system through the exact same mechanical action every time you use it. The 14 to 80 million particle estimate is specifically the portion that makes it into what you eat. The portion going down your drain is a separate, additional figure, one the original study was not even designed to fully quantify. This is worth understanding because it tells you something about scale. A kitchen sponge primarily contaminates wastewater. A cutting board does both simultaneously by the same physical mechanism, in the same few seconds of contact between blade and surface. The original cutting board research answered an exposure question. It did not answer a biological one. How much microplastic enters your food is one measurement. What that microplastic does once it is inside a living digestive system is an entirely different study, requiring a different kind of evidence. That evidence arrived this year. A research team published a study in which mice were fed diets prepared using food cut on polypropylene, polyethylene, and willow wood cutting boards over periods of 4 and 12 weeks, designed specifically to mirror the exposure pathway identified in the original cutting board research. The team measured inflammatory markers in the bloodstream, including C-reactive protein and tumor necrosis factor, both standard indicators of systemic inflammation used throughout clinical medicine. They also examined the gut microbiota, the bacterial population that lives in the digestive tract and plays a measurable role in digestion, immune function, and a growing list of other physiological processes. The mice exposed to microplastics from the plastic cutting boards over the 12-week period showed measurable changes in both categories, elevated inflammatory markers and altered gut bacterial composition compared to the group whose food was prepared on the wooden board. I want to be precise about what this does and does not establish. This is a mouse study, not a human trial. 12 weeks in a mouse is not 12 weeks in a human life, and rodent gut physiology, while a useful model, is not identical to ours. What this study establishes is a plausible biological mechanism connecting the exposure that the original research measured to a physiological consequence that can actually be tracked. That link is now documented in a controlled setting. The human-scale question, what equivalent exposure does to an equivalent gut over decades rather than weeks, remains the work still ahead. The reason a cutting board behaves this way comes down to something simple about how plastic is structured. Both polyethylene and polypropylene are made of long repeating chains of molecules arranged in a way that gives the material its rigidity and shape. A steel blade is harder than either plastic. When it presses down and slides across the surface, it does not just mark the surface. It physically removes material at the microscopic level, the same way sandpaper removes wood, just at a scale too fine to see without specialized imaging. Every visible knife mark you have ever seen on a cutting board, the scratches that build up over months of use, is the visible evidence of this process. The particles you cannot see are the same process at a smaller scale. The board does not have to look damaged for this to be happening. It is happening from the very first cut. None of this requires panic, and it does not require an immediate kitchen overhaul. It requires one material decision and two habit adjustments. The material decision is straightforward. Wood and bamboo cutting boards do not shed microplastic particles because they are not plastic. They have their own maintenance requirements, mainly proper drying and occasional oiling to prevent cracking, but they do not introduce synthetic polymer fragments into your food through cutting. If you are replacing a board, this is the single highest impact change available. If a full replacement is not practical right now, the first habit adjustment is board rotation based on visible wear rather than a fixed schedule. The research is consistent on this point. Boards with more visible knife scarring release more particles than newer boards with smoother surfaces, because the scarred grooves create more edges for the blade to catch and remove material from on each subsequent cut. A board that looks heavily scored is past the point where replacement makes sense, regardless of how long you have owned it. The second habit adjustment is task-specific separation. If you own both plastic and wood boards, reserve the plastic board for tasks where particle transfer matters less, cutting items that will be cooked at high heat for extended periods, and use the wood or bamboo board for anything eaten raw or lightly cooked. This will not eliminate exposure if you keep any plastic board in rotation, but it meaningfully reduces the highest risk use cases. Here is something the coverage of this research consistently fails to mention, and it is the detail that should actually change your shopping habits more than any other fact in this video. The North Dakota State team found that polypropylene released more material than polyethylene under identical cutting conditions. Walk into almost any kitchen supply store today, and the harder, more rigid, more premium-looking cutting boards, the ones marketed as more durable and professional grade, are very often polypropylene specifically because of that rigidity. The softer, cheaper-feeling polyethylene boards, the ones that might look like the inferior option on a shelf, measured lower in this specific research. This means the instinct to buy the sturdier, more expensive-looking plastic board, the one that feels like the more serious choice, can in this particular case point you toward the option that released more material in controlled testing. That is not a reason to buy the cheaper plastic board either. It is a reason to skip plastic entirely if you are making a new purchase, because the visual cues you would normally use to judge quality do not track with this particular kind of risk at all. Pick up your knife again. Look at the board underneath it one more time. What you are looking at is not a neutral surface. It is an active participant in every meal you prepare on it, shedding material into your food by the same mechanical process that makes it useful in the first place. The North Dakota research measured the exposure. This year's mouse study measured what that exposure does to a living gut over time. Neither study is the final word. Both are a meaningful step further than where this conversation stood even 2 years ago. The fix here does not require you to distrust your entire kitchen. It requires one material choice, made once, that removes this specific exposure route permanently. Wood or bamboo, properly maintained, does the same job your plastic board does without doing the part of the job nobody intended it to do. If you want the next object in your kitchen examined with this same level of care, subscribing is the most direct way to get it. Every video here takes one ordinary tool and follows the evidence as far as it currently goes. No further and no less. I will see you in the next